There is a particular kind of economic pain that is uniquely difficult to prepare for. Not because it's unpredictable. In many cases, it's entirely predictable, at least in broad structural terms. Not because it arrives without warning. The warnings are almost always there for anyone looking in the right places. But because the gap between when the conditions that produce the pain are set in motion and when ordinary people actually feel the consequences in their daily lives is long enough that most of the population doesn't connect the two. By the time the pain is undeniable, by the time it shows up at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in the mortgage payment, the decisions that could have made a difference have already been made or missed. The window for intelligent preparation has already closed. I've spent a significant portion of my professional life studying exactly this kind of dynamic. The slow-moving economic forces that are entirely visible to anyone who knows where to look, but that most people don't look at until it's too late to do anything other than react. The gaps between what the official narratives say and what the physical, measurable reality of the world is actually doing. The moments when those two things, the story being told and the reality playing out, diverge far enough that the eventual convergence becomes violent rather than gradual. We are in one of those moments right now, and I want to talk about it, not to frighten you, not to generate anxiety, but because I believe that understanding what is actually happening with clarity and without the distortion of either false optimism or conspiratorial panic is genuinely useful. It is the only foundation from which intelligent decisions can be made. So let's talk about oil and what an oil shock actually means for the American economy, and why I think most people are significantly underestimating what is coming. The first thing I want to establish, because I think it's the foundation of everything else I'm going to say, is that most people's mental model of oil is badly wrong. And a badly wrong mental model leads to badly wrong conclusions about what an oil disruption actually means. Most people think of oil as gasoline, as the thing that makes their car go, and yes, that's part of it. But it is a remarkably small part of the actual role that oil plays in the functioning of a modern economy. Oil is not a commodity in the way that most commodities are commodities. It is not one input among many that gets used to produce one category of output. It is, and I want to be precise about this, the physical substrate on which the entire architecture of modern economic activity is built. Think about what that actually means. Every piece of food that arrives at a grocery store required oil to get there. Not just for the truck that delivered it, for the machinery that planted the crops, for the fertilizer that made the crops grow, for the factory that processed the raw ingredients, for the packaging that contains the product, for every point in the supply chain between the ground and the shelf. Oil is embedded in the cost of food at every single one of those stages. Every manufactured product, from the simplest household item to the most sophisticated piece of technology, required oil somewhere in its production or delivery chain. The plastics, the chemicals, the transportation, the industrial heat. Oil is the energy input that underlies the physical production of almost everything. Every service that requires physical infrastructure, hospitals, schools, logistics, construction, is running on a foundation of energy costs that are directly linked to the price of oil. When I say oil is the plumbing system of the economy, I mean it in the most literal and comprehensive sense. It is not one pipe among many. It is the primary pipe. And when the primary pipe is under stress, when the supply is constrained, when the price is elevated, when the physical availability of oil diverges from what the paper markets are pricing it at, the effects do not stay contained to the oil sector. They spread through every supply chain, through every cost structure, through every business model that assumed a certain energy cost when it set its prices and its margins. And eventually, not immediately but inevitably, they reach the end consumer. That spreading process takes time. That is the dynamic I want you to understand. The conditions that produce an oil shock and the moment when ordinary Americans feel that shock at the gas pump and in the grocery store are separated by weeks and sometimes months. The pipeline is long. The buffer is real but finite. And right now, that buffer is being consumed. Let me walk through how an oil shock actually propagates through an economy, because I think understanding the mechanism is more valuable than any specific prediction I could make about timing or magnitude. An oil shock begins with a supply disruption. Something, geopolitical, physical, structural, reduces the flow of oil from where it is to where it needs to be. This can happen in many ways. It can be a reduction in production. It can be a disruption to transportation routes. It can be a combination of factors that creates a cumulative shortfall in what is available to the global market relative to what the global market needs. When that happens, the first response in the market is almost always a divergence between different price signals. The most visible prices, the ones that are most easily tradable, most liquid, most accessible to financial markets, adjust relatively quickly to incorporate the new information. But the physical prices, the actual cost of getting a real barrel of oil onto a real ship and delivered to a real refinery, often tell a very different story. This divergence matters enormously, and it matters for a reason that most financial commentary misses. The financial price of oil is, in the short run, determined by expectations and sentiment and the mechanics of futures markets. The physical price of oil is determined by the immediate supply-demand balance in the real world, by what buyers who actually need oil right now are willing to pay to get it. Those two prices can diverge significantly for a period of time, but they cannot diverge forever. Eventually, reality wins. Eventually, the physical price, the price that the actual economy experiences, becomes the price. The question is always how long the divergence lasts and what happens when it closes. In every historical oil shock I've studied, the convergence between the paper price and the physical price has been a significant event, not a gentle adjustment. A repricing that propagates through the entire cost structure of the economy, through transportation, through manufacturing, through agriculture, through every sector that uses energy as an input, which is to say, every sector. That repricing is what I mean when I say an oil shock is coming to America. Not that oil hasn't already gone up. It has. But the full effect of a sustained, significant oil supply disruption takes time to work its way through the economy. The early stages feel manageable. The later stages are where the real pain is felt. And based on everything I'm looking at right now, the physical supply situation, the structure of global shipping routes, the current state of strategic reserves across major consuming nations, the later stages are approaching. I want to spend time on historical precedent because I think it is the most honest and the most useful lens I can offer on the current situation. I've studied every major oil disruption of the past century, not just as economic history, but as a pattern recognition exercise. I want to understand the mechanism by which these events unfold, because the mechanism is more predictive than any specific analogy. Here is what I've found consistently. The initial market response to an oil supply disruption is almost always an underestimate. Markets are calibrated to recent experience. They process new information through the lens of what they've seen before. And in most periods, oil supply disruptions have been modest, temporary, and resolved relatively quickly. So when a more significant disruption occurs, the initial market response tends to treat it as another modest, temporary event. This initial underestimate creates a window, a period during which the market has not yet fully priced the disruption, that can last weeks or sometimes months. During this window, the official narrative tends toward optimism. The paper prices are relatively contained. The visible financial indicators suggest that the disruption is being absorbed. And most ordinary investors watching those visible indicators conclude that the alarm was overstated. Then the physical reality catches up. When it does, the adjustment is typically sharp, rapid, and broad. Because the divergence between the financial story and the physical reality has been accumulating. When it closes fast. And because the effect of higher oil costs takes time to work through supply chains before it reaches the consumer, the end consumer experience of the shock often arrives well after the financial markets have already started adjusting. This is the pattern. It is repeated with variations across the major oil shocks of the past 50 years. The specific causes differ. The specific timing differs. The specific countries and sectors most affected differ. But the underlying mechanism, underestimate, divergence, catch-up, consumer impact, has been remarkably consistent. And right now, looking at the current situation through that pattern recognition lens, I see a development that is in the early to middle stages of this familiar progression. The initial underestimate is happening. The divergence between financial narratives and physical reality is visible to anyone who looks. The catch-up has not yet fully occurred. That is why I'm talking about this now, rather than after the fact. Because the most useful time to understand the structure of an oil shock is before the final stages of it arrive at the gas pump and the grocery store. After that, the window for preparation is substantially closed. Let me talk about what an oil shock does to the broader economic environment, specifically to inflation and to the Federal Reserve's ability to respond to it, because this is the dimension of the current situation that I think is most consequential for long-term investors and most underappreciated in the current conversation. The relationship between oil prices and inflation is not direct and immediate. It works through supply chains, through production costs, through transportation costs, through the price of everything that requires energy to make or move. The full inflationary effect of a significant oil price increase typically takes 6 to 12 months to be fully reflected in the consumer prices that show up in the official inflation statistics. That time lag is important for two reasons. First, it means that the inflationary pressure from the current oil disruption has not yet been fully felt in the official numbers. The readings that the Federal Reserve is currently looking at do not yet fully incorporate the energy cost increases that are already embedded in the supply chains that supply American consumers. The inflation that is already baked in has not yet been measured. Second, and more importantly, it creates a policy trap. The Federal Reserve's primary tool for managing inflation is interest rates. When inflation is too high, they raise rates to slow economic activity and reduce price pressure. But here is the problem with an oil-driven inflation. Raising interest rates does not produce more oil. It does not resolve a supply disruption. It does not bring physical commodity prices back down to where the paper markets want them to be. What raising interest rates does in the context of an oil shock is slow the economy. It reduces demand. It increases the cost of borrowing for businesses and households. It makes the real economic pain worse, even while doing relatively little to address the underlying inflationary driver, which is physical supply rather than excess demand. This is the trap. Inflation is rising, which the Fed's mandate requires it to address. But the tool available to address inflation will, in this context, cause economic harm without fully resolving the underlying problem. Every major oil shock in the post-war era has created some version of this trap. The Federal Reserve has had to make genuinely difficult choices between allowing inflation to persist and deliberately inducing an economic slowdown. Neither choice has been costless. Neither has been popular. And in each case, the resolution has taken significantly longer and cost significantly more than the initial official projections suggested. I'm not predicting a specific outcome here. The range of possible resolutions is genuinely wide. It depends on geopolitical developments that are inherently uncertain. It depends on policy decisions that have not yet been made. It depends on whether the physical supply situation resolves faster than the structural evidence currently suggests it will. What I am saying is that the structure of the current situation, oil supply under pressure, inflationary effects working their way through supply chains, Federal Reserve constrained in its ability to respond, is a structure that historically has produced significant economic disruption. And investors and households who understand that structure are better positioned to navigate it than those who are relying on official price signals that have not yet caught up to physical reality. I want to bring this down to the level of the individual household because I think the macro analysis is only useful insofar as it translates into something actionable for real people making real decisions. An oil shock of the magnitude currently unfolding, if it persists, and the structural evidence suggests it will, affects American households through several distinct channels simultaneously. The most immediate and most visible is energy costs. Gasoline prices, heating costs, electricity costs in regions where power generation depends on fossil fuels. These are the most direct and most rapid transmission mechanisms. They are also the ones most Americans are currently watching. But the less visible channels are in many ways more significant for the medium-term financial situation of the average household. Food costs are the most important. As I described earlier, oil is embedded in the production cost of food at every stage of the supply chain. When oil is significantly more expensive for a sustained period, not a spike that corrects in weeks, but a structurally elevated price that persists for months, it works its way into food prices. Gradually at first, then more visibly. The historical evidence from every major oil disruption is clear on this. Energy price increases precede food price increases by 6 to 12 months. If the current oil situation is what the physical evidence suggests it is, the food price effects are not yet fully reflected in what Americans are paying at the grocery store. They are coming. Transportation costs are the next channel. Everything that moves requires energy. When transportation costs rise, the cost of everything that is transported rises. In an economy as geographically distributed as the United States, where food moves thousands of miles from farm to table, where manufactured goods travel from coast to coast, transportation cost increases are a universal tax on the cost of living. And then there is the interest rate channel. If oil-driven inflation persists and forces the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates elevated or push them higher, which the historical precedent suggests is the most likely policy response, the cost of carrying debt rises. For households with variable rate mortgages, with credit card balances, with car payments, elevated interest rates are a direct and immediate reduction in disposable income. These channels do not operate in isolation. They compound. They interact, and they arrive, because of the various time lags in how oil price increases propagate through the economy, in sequence, not simultaneously. Which means the full effect of the current disruption on the American household is likely not yet visible in the current economic data. Understanding that sequence, understanding that what you're seeing today in your gas prices and your grocery bill is not the full picture of what is coming, is the most important practical insight I can offer. I want to be careful here because I think the concept of preparation in the context of an economic disruption is easily distorted in both directions. One distortion is panic, the sense that catastrophe is inevitable and imminent and that extreme measures are required. I don't believe that. Economic systems are resilient. The United States economy has navigated serious oil disruptions before. It has the institutional capacity, the reserve capacity, and the structural flexibility to absorb significant shocks without catastrophic breakdown. Panic is not preparation. It is a failure of clear thinking at exactly the moment when clear thinking matters most. The other distortion is denial, the sense that because the official narrative is optimistic and the visible financial indicators are not yet screaming, there is nothing to think about or prepare for. That is equally wrong. The time lag between when the conditions for disruption are established and when the consumer feels the effects is real, but it is not infinite. The preparation window that exists right now will close. Intelligent preparation, in my view, lives between those two extremes. It is calm, methodical, and proportionate. It is based on an honest assessment of probabilities rather than either certainty of catastrophe or certainty of smooth resolution. For households, it means reviewing their actual exposure to the channels I described. Energy costs, food costs, transportation costs, interest rate sensitivity, and asking honestly whether their current financial situation can absorb a meaningful increase in each of those costs simultaneously. Not asking whether they can survive the worst case. Asking whether they can absorb a significant but not catastrophic version of what the historical evidence says is likely. For investors, it means asking whether their portfolio is positioned for a sustained period of elevated inflation, not just a brief spike, but a structural period of higher prices, and what the implications of that are for the specific assets they hold. Different assets have very different historical behavior in inflationary environments. Understanding that behavior and making deliberate rather than reactive decisions about it is the difference between preparing and reacting. In both cases, the key word is deliberate. The preparation that matters is the preparation done now, before the full effect of the disruption arrives. After it arrives, after the gas prices have already spiked and the grocery bills are already 20% higher and the mortgage payment has already adjusted upward, the best available responses are worse than the responses available today. That is why I'm having this conversation now. Not to alarm, to inform, because the window for deliberate preparation is open. And historically, that window does not stay open indefinitely. Before my closing thoughts, a few brief things. First, I've put together a document that walks through specifically how I think about protecting household financial resilience during periods of significant inflationary pressure, the framework I use to evaluate exposure to the channels I described, and the kinds of adjustments worth considering in advance rather than after the fact. It's in the description and it's completely free. I'd encourage you to read it thoughtfully and honestly apply it to your own situation. Second, if you want to go deeper on the macro environment, on how to think about geopolitical and economic disruptions through a principled, framework-driven lens rather than through the noise of the daily news cycle, I've built a community around exactly that kind of serious, long-horizon thinking. The details are in the description. And third, if this conversation is the kind you want more of, subscribe. These dynamics are not resolving next week. I intend to keep tracking them with the same commitment to honesty and clarity regardless of where they go. Let me close with this. The title of this video is "The Oil Shock is About to Hit America." I want to be precise about what I mean by that, and equally precise about what I don't mean. I don't mean that collapse is imminent. I don't mean that American society is about to break. I don't mean that the only rational response is fear or withdrawal or extreme defensive measures. What I mean is this: the physical reality of a significant oil supply disruption is currently working its way through global supply chains, through energy markets, through food production systems, and the full effect of that reality has not yet been reflected in what American consumers are paying for the things they buy every day. That gap between the physical reality of the disruption and the consumer-level experience of its effects is temporary. It always is. The transmission mechanism between an energy shock and the household budget is not immediate, but it is reliable. And based on the historical pattern of how these transmissions work, the timing of when Americans will feel this fully is not years away. It is months. The investors and households who understand this, who have taken the time to look honestly at the physical evidence rather than the paper price signals, who have made deliberate decisions in advance rather than reactive ones after the fact, they will be in a meaningfully better position than those who are surprised. That is the point of this video. Not alarm, clarity. And the most useful thing I can offer right now, in the face of a genuinely uncertain but structurally comprehensible situation, is the clearest possible picture of what the evidence actually shows and what the historical pattern actually predicts. You now have that picture. What you do with it is up to you. I'll see you in the next one.